This is chess, a game between two armies on an 8x8 board and two very delicate kings. If a king gets captured, the game ends. This means the king is the most valuable piece, but chess has a few more pieces, so let's start from the beginning. You see this row here? This row belongs to the main line of attack. These are the pawns. A pawn is like an intern that just started the game and it's at the mercy of the higher valued pieces. A pawn is worth 1 point and can only move forward and can only capture a piece that is 1 square diagonally forward, to the left, or right. A pawn can only move diagonally when there is a piece to capture, otherwise it's limited to only forward. If another piece is blocking the path forward, then the pawn is just stuck. Even though it's the least valuable piece, the pawn has two cool abilities. The first one is that it can advance 2 squares forward on the first move. After that, a pawn is limited to only 1 square per move. And as an intern, the pawn's second ability is to promote into any piece they like if they manage to breach the enemy defenses. Or more precisely, if they reach the last row. Now we move to higher valued pieces. The bishops and the knights here are worth 3 points each, and while they have the same value, they are played very differently. Imagine the bishop as an archer that sits across the field and snipes the enemy. A bishop can move diagonally back and forth across the whole board, but if an obstacle is on their way, then they cannot move past it. But if it is an enemy piece, then they can just take it. Very powerful. That is why the devs needed to nerf it a bit. You see, we have 2 bishops in the game, the white squared bishop and the black squared bishop. Both of these pieces can never move to a different color other than the one they start on. The knights, on the other hand, have a lot more freedom. Think of knights as guys who master the art of yoga and are constantly moving in an unpredictable L shape. Knights move 2 squares in straight pathways, and then take a left or a right. Compared to other pieces, knights have a cool ability that can move to a free square they want, even if something blocks a square along the way. But if a piece is blocking the destination, then the knights also have the same restriction, meaning they can take the piece or move to a different square. There are 2 more pieces you need to learn, the rooks and the queen, which are considered major pieces. The rooks are worth 5 points each, and they're like enemy tanks marching into the battlefield after the other pieces have ruined each other. A rook can move up and down, or side to side, for as many squares as they want. But they are still not the most valuable piece. Instead, it's the queen, worth 9 points. The queen moves like a combination of the rook and the bishop, meaning it can move left, right, top, bottom, and diagonally. Unlike bishops, the queen is not limited to the original square color, and unlike the rook, it can deal with diagonal threats way better. But the devs thought about it, and that is why they gave the same restriction to the queen and the rook, meaning if they are blocked, they can take the piece or move to a different square, but they cannot go past it. Now it's time to explain the king, the most important piece in chess. The king can move 1 square in any direction to escape, attack, or defend pieces. But the king has like one insane nerf. If a king is threatened, all the other pieces cannot move unless they defend the king. If the pieces are defending the king, then they cannot move out of the way since the king would get exposed and the game would end. Normally the devs thought about this and made it illegal for the king to sabotage. Meaning even if the king can move freely, it cannot expose himself to a square covered by the enemy pieces. The king can move out of the way or get protected by its pieces, but when there is no option left for him, that's when the game ends. Whoever captures the enemy king wins the game. But kings also know how to cheat the system a little bit. If there are no other pieces that can move, and the king is not threatened but has no possible safe options to move in, then the game ends in a draw. The devs, however, wanted to balance things a bit. I mean, the king should have a way to protect himself instead of just being in front of the center all the time. Introducing castling. The only move in chess where 2 pieces move at the same time. Castling is simple. The king moves 2 squares to the left or right, and the rook follows on the other side of the king. If the rook is closer, then we call it kingside castle. If the rook is further away, then it's called queenside castle. If you have trouble memorizing all this, just remember that the king only moves 2 squares and the rook follows. What you do have to worry about, though, are the castling rules, because the opponent will try to abuse them. Here are the rules. The spaces between the king and the rook must be empty. The king cannot be in check, and the squares where the king passes and lands should not be threatened by enemy pieces. The rook and the king can only castle if both have not moved from their starting square. If one of the pieces move and go back to their square, it still does not count because it's only the first move that allows castling. Kind of like the double jump we mentioned for the pawns. But since we are talking about pawns, there is one last rule you need to know. By introducing castling, the king becomes a bit too protected. After all, he can just castle and block the game using pawns. So, the devs had to create a way for pawns to stop the double jump. If a pawn is to the left or right of the double jump, then that pawn can cut diagonally as if the pawn only moved one square. Now that you have learned how pieces move, it's time to really understand the game. Try to think of chess as a coverage game, meaning you try to cover more squares than your opponent. Here, take this position for example. Who do you think is winning? Normally the side with the higher points has the advantage, but let's look at the square coverage. The white side has these surrounding squares covered by the king, and these two diagonal squares are covered by the pawn. Let's compare it to the opponent. The black king covers its surrounding squares, and the queen covers up, right, down, left, and the diagonals. But the queen still doesn't threaten anything since it doesn't cover any squares where the white pieces are located. Now let's assume it's black to move. The queen goes to the diagonal on her left, and if we look at the coverage again, on her left side, the queen checks the king, and on top of her, she attacks the pawn. The white king has no choice but to move and pass the turn to the opponent. The black queen is then free to take the pawn. So, coverage of the pieces is not only what it reaches in the moment, but also what it has the potential to do. The true potential of chess pieces is how they cover areas together in their attack or defense. Let's examine the attack first. We have the same position, but we make it slightly more complicated with a bishop and a knight. Black is still winning, but this time we can't just attack the king and take the pawn like we did last time, because it's covered by the bishop, and the bishop is protected by the king. So, what do? Well, we tried to combine covered areas in our attack. Currently, the knight is not doing anything here, so we move the knight here, attacking the pawn. White cannot move the pawn since it would immediately escape the bishop's coverage, and the queen would have an easy time grabbing it in the future. So, the other option is to just stall with the movement of the king or the bishops. White goes back with the king. The black queen moves diagonally again, and once again we see that the coverage of the queen has two targets. This is how chess pieces attack, by creating common coverage where they can attack pieces. Now we know that we need to take that pawn, so how do we do it? You most likely answered with the knight, and you would be right, because choosing what piece to trade goes back to the values for each piece. It wouldn't make sense to sacrifice the queen, which is worth 9 points, for a pawn and a bishop, which are worth 4 points total. Taking with the knight, on the other hand, means you sacrifice 3 points of your own to take away 4 points of material from your opponent. Good job! You learned how to attack efficiently in chess, but now you need to learn how to defend your pieces using everything you have learned so far. In theory, attacking and defending should be pretty much the same, but it's often way harder for a beginner to defend efficiently against enemy attacks. This happens thanks to a thing we call tunnel vision. It's funny, but when a beginner starts chess, they actually profit a bit from tunnel vision when it comes to attacking. Since they can't see the opponent's defenses very well, they just proceed with their plan, and sometimes that just works. Even if we put luck out of the way, it's just generally way easier to attack in chess, because you can only focus on a few pieces at a time. But for defense, you really need to examine the board more, since you might have many options for defending, but not all of them are good. Take this position for example. A beginner would see the white bishop attacking the black bishop and would start panicking. I mean, surely this is a big threat because the bishop here is very close to the king. So, what's the correct way to defend? Well, let's examine. Option 1 is to attack the bishop before it attacks us. That would eliminate the bishop, but the queen here would just take our piece and pose as an even more dangerous threat. Option 2 is to just leave it and develop other pieces like this white squared bishop here. If you picked option 2, you would be right. The king is not in danger. He might seem a bit surrounded, but what's the worst thing that can happen? Pieces of the same value get traded, and the king moves in a square that can be checked diagonally, but since the black squared bishop is gone, you don't really have to worry that much anymore. Only the queen can check you on that square, but the opponent would first have to develop his other pieces so he can afford to attack with the queen. But what if you picked option 1? Well, that could turn into a game-ending mistake very fast. After the trading of pieces, the queen is very close to checkmating the king. All it needs is a piece that it can work with in its attack. If after this, you decide to develop the bishop like last time, thinking you still have a lot of time, then the opponent will move the knight here, and now the game is over. Both the queen and the knight attack this pawn here, and the king has nowhere to go. Even if it was not blocked by its own pieces, the knight would cover these two squares and the queen would cover these other two, which obviously is very bad news. But now it's checkmate. There is nothing black can do to stop the queen in time, but it could have done something on the previous move. Let's assume you made a mistake and allowed the queen to move. Now you have to keep defending a non-favorable position. A chess game most of the time is not about just one mistake. Instead, it's a collection of moves that give or take advantage of the position. Sure, you messed up the previous move, but now you can just compensate by making your pawn structure a bit vulnerable to stop the knight from closing in. You can even push the queen out with your own queen if the opponent plays passively. The point is that chess is a back and forth game until the final mistake. Now that you know how to defend and attack, it's time to learn openings and mid-game. There are like 1,000 openings in chess, but only 20 of them are really popular. You can try out different openings and gambits, but for now, let's focus on an opening called the Sicilian Defense. It starts like this. Your opponent moves pawn to e4. That pawn now covers the center of the board. You respond with pawn to c5. Now you cover these two squares. The opponent follows with the knight to f3, and then you reply with knight to c6. Both the knight and pawn cover this square, which for chess is very important since that's the center. So white normally does not want you to keep adding into that square, so they push the pawn to d4, attacking the pawn. You, on the other hand, are happy to exchange pawns here. Sure, you lose a piece of the center, but you are forcing white into a more open position that is focused on attack, while yours is a bit more closed and is focused on defense. Which explains the name Sicilian Defense here, but really there are a lot of variations on how you can play this opening. But since we want to keep things closed, the next move is knight to f6. White follows with the knight out, and then you reply with pawn to d6. You are taking up more space but still keeping everything compact. White replies with bishop to c4, and you then block its path with a defending move, pawn to e6. Next, both pieces move out the bishops to protect the knights and open the way for kings to castle. White moves the queen e2, and finally black castles kingside and white castles queenside. This is the opening, but we have to analyze it a bit before we move on to midgame. Basically, an opening is just a way to send out your pieces and take as much space as you can without compromising your position. Look at the coverage for white. It pretty much covers all of the center, and the pieces that are threatened are defended. The knight here is defended by the bishop and the rook. The pawn defended by the knight. Now let's look at the black side. Once again, the coverage is great. Not as much as white, but it is way easier to manage. After all, white has no clear attacking path with all that pawn structure. So you don't need to learn many openings or even none at all, but you do have to keep in mind that the center is important, and your pieces have to be developed. When you develop your pieces, make sure to strike a balance between developing and protecting your king. Now, you are prepared for the mid-game. Mid-game is probably the most fun part about chess. In a mid-game, your main goal is to try to break through defenses of the other side while still defending your own pieces. Here where we left on, white will try to reach the king side using these pawns. It will push these pawns forward and will try to expose the king's defenses as much as possible. Black on the other side will defend, but it will also try to attack the white king side by pushing these pawns, or by pushing the game from the center. Learning the mid-game is part of the process of becoming a better chess player, and it comes with experience, but still, let me show you a few tips that will help you a lot. The first one is trading pieces. When trading a piece in chess, of course you have to look at the value of points, but you also have to look at the position. If you want to trade a piece, you are doing so in hopes of that exchange helping you in some way. Maybe you weaken enemy defenses, or you have a plan and want to go for it. But you don't want to exchange just because you have the option. For example, let's assume black moves the pawn and white here has the option to exchange knights. After exchanging, white would soon realize he made a mistake. Black, without even trying, just made the best pawn fortress it can hope for, and the king is tucked away in safety. Black now has an easier line of taking the center and attacking the king. So, when it comes to trading pieces, you really have to pick your battles. Next is to leave the queen alone. I know this is funny to say, but you should not go full-on attack with the queen during the mid-game. Sure, the queen is the strongest piece, but it's also the most valuable piece on the whole board, so you can't risk losing it. You can use the queen if you have a really powerful line of attack, but if you don't, then that queen should instead be used to keep pieces protected and allow other pieces to break through defenses first. If you want to trade queens, that is fine too, but you have to keep in mind the first tip. The final one is to really be careful with the pawns. Pawns are like coins. Sure, you don't want to waste your time and would rather pay with a dollar bill, but when you use coins, it just feels right. It's the same with chess. The pawn is really boring, and most players would rather play with a knight or a queen. But just like life, we have to work with what is given to us. By the way, this is your reminder to use that huge pile of coins that are sitting in your wallet. Now, why are pawns so crucial? Well, that's because they are the first line of defense and attack during midgame. They also decide the game during the endgame, but for now let's go back to the Sicilian defense. Here, black has two very distinguished pawns. Black can push this pawn forward to dominate the center. White has no other choice but to move the knight. If white wants to get rid of that pawn structure, it's going to have to use other pawns or try to focus on the weak point of a pawn structure. The final tip about pawns is that they are strong when they are close to other pawns. If we have a pawn here protected only by a knight or a queen and no other pawns to the left or right, consider that pawn gone. So always be mindful of keeping those good boys together and not throwing them away carelessly. Now we can move on to the endgame. As the name suggests, an endgame is the final part of the game. That's when you check the king and leave no squares for him to escape. The most common endgame ending you're going to see is the king directly in front of the opposing king, and a rook or a queen checking him in the last row. Sometimes the king is blocked by his own pieces. Sometimes the queen just completely surrounds him, or sometimes there are two rooks blocking two rows completely. Either way, you are going to figure these out eventually. But the hard part of an endgame is getting to the point where you have a clear advantage over your opponent. A great endgame tip I have for you is to analyze 2 or 3 moves ahead in a forced variation. I'm not telling you to become a calculator, but to also see what the opponent can do when you force a move. Like, look at this position. You are obviously in a bad spot. You see that you are a rook against a knight, so the normal thought process is that you should remove the rook. That is why a beginner would play something like knight to e7. But this is what I mean when I say that you should at least calculate forcing moves as much as possible. Now the opponent has an easier idea of what to do. Move the rook, and since it looks good, maybe pin the knight to the king. That doesn't mean forcing moves are bad, but they are only good if the opponent doesn't have many options. In this case, the best move is attacking the king with pawn to b6. By calculating a few moves ahead, you see that the white king has 2 legal moves. The square on d5, which allows the knight on e7 to fork both pieces. The other legal move is c4, which once again allows a fork on e5. In endgames, we also have endgame patterns. Basically, set moves to do that are optimal for a position. Like in this position, if it's white to move, then it's a draw. If it's black to move, then white wins. We call this chess pattern the king and pawn endgame. The white king here wants to promote into a queen and then mate. The black king, on the other hand, wants to end in a stalemate. But let's play the game here. White now has to move. He can't go forward since the king is covering these squares. So, he has to go back. The black king then sees an opportunity, which blocks the pawn and threatens it at the same time. The white king needs to protect it, so they go back and forth. But what if you pushed with the pawn? Well, the king slides into safety, and white really has no choice but to let the black king take the pawn, or to completely block the king's path. Either way, it's a stalemate. But here, if black has to move, it will go in the center, and the white king can just push the pawn. The king will go to the left, and the white king will cover the opposing squares. Then white promotes and wins the game. Either way, these are endgame patterns. You can learn them yourself a bit later. The pawn is one of the most underrated pieces in chess. A beginner looks at the pawn and immediately goes to play with the cooler pieces. However, pawns are the foundation of a good structure in chess, and if they fall, then the whole game goes horribly wrong. That is why in this video, I will be explaining how to really use the pawn in all stages of the game. First, let's go over the opening. In most openings, pawns are used to take control of the center and to allow other pieces to develop. Simple, right? Well, not really, because beginners don't fundamentally understand how pawns affect the board. Here, let's divide each pawn move into 3 categories: developing, weakening, and suppressing moves. Now using these categories, let's analyze the most popular opening move in chess, pawn to e4. But why is this so popular? If you asked a normal chess player, they would probably say it just feels right, but we can analyze it a bit better using our table here. First, let's look at the developing one. By moving to e4, this pawn is now covering the center. The queen and the bishop are also semi-developed, meaning they still cover some of the board without moving at all. This is passive income, but for chess pieces. So, on the development front, this is doing great. Now let's look at the weakening side. Previously, this pawn was protecting these squares, and after moving, these squares are still protected. The e4 pawn is also in a position that can easily be defended. So, we are doing great on the weakening front too. What about the suppressing moves? Well, by being in the center, the opponent is kind of restricted on these white squares and he has to adjust his playstyle one way or another. With all of these good stats, e4 belongs on the S tier. But now let's look at a more controversial move. Pawn to g3. The idea behind this is to put out the bishop between the pawns and then castle the king. If you play chess a lot, you have seen people play these moves, but chances are you have also seen the game end like this. Is this pawn move bad? Well, not really. It just has its own set of disadvantages that you need to be aware of. On the developing front, this move allows you to position the bishop well and get the knight out. After that comes castling and the king is tucked away in safety. For now at least. Because when you look at the weakening side, you're not doing yourself a favor. Sure, you are developing your pieces, but you are creating weak spots that can be exploited later on. And if you ever lose your key bishop while your opponent still has theirs, then you are most likely cooked. When it comes to board suppression, this bishop does cover the center and aims at the rook, but most of the time it is going to play a more passive role. So definitely A tier. If you are curious of what an F tier pawn move is, the answer is pawn to f3. It develops hardly anything because it also blocks the knight, the king gets exposed, and the opponent is free to take the center. This is what you should play if you are ever on a loss rating spiral so you can blame it on the opening. Now we move on to the mid-game. You not only have to keep in mind the three categories, but you also need to consider the possibilities of movement. During the opening, we just had to move up. In the middle game, pawns now have more of a choice. Do you try to take a piece? Do you go past it? Or do nothing? Honestly, that's the reason why some consider the middle game to be the hardest part of the game. But I have two important tips for you. First, pawn awareness. Here, let's take this example. It's black to move, and it looks kind of scary. I mean, the knight and the queen target this square, so what should you do? A beginner is most likely certain to make this mistake during their chess journey. Trying to get the knight out, they will push the f7 pawn forward and then get shocked when the knight forks both the rook and the queen. To find the answer, we just have to look at our categories again. The f7 pawn was never moved, but that doesn't mean that it's doing anything wrong. In that position, that pawn offers support for the bishop, protects the king, and restricts attacks on the e6 square. If you are going to move a pawn, then those stats need to be higher, or a pawn move is just not worth it. If we move our pawn forward, we don't just allow ourselves a fork with e6 no longer being restricted, but we also leave the bishop defenseless and the king is more exposed on the white diagonals. So, comparing our stats, we realize that it's just not worth it to move the pawn. Instead, the best move is to activate our knight here to hopefully fork these pieces or at least remove the black squared bishop. Good job! You learned the art of pawn awareness. The second tip is pawn breaks. This is a pawn move that wants to open up the position by attacking enemy pawns. Sounds simple, but even grandmasters like Magnus Carlsen can make the wrong move sometimes. Here is a recent game between Magnus Carlsen and Erigaisi Arjun. Magnus does not like these pawns in the center, and neither should you since the opponent will try progressing on this side of the board. So, you need to break one of these pawns. Which one are you choosing? Obviously, the center one is heavily protected, so nothing we can do there. The one on the right is protected by the queen, and if we attack with this pawn, we just have no way of defending it since our rook would get exposed. The only sensible option is to attack this pawn here, on the left. Magnus arrived at the same conclusion. He decided to break this pawn structure by moving pawn to f5. The idea is that ideally, if the opponent takes, then Magnus immediately activates the bishop, opening up the position and gaining advantage. You and I might fall for that, but the opponent didn't, and instead pushed pawn to a5. And this is where Magnus made the wrong move. He analyzed for a few minutes and continued with the pawn break, even though it makes way more sense to push forward the pawn and completely focus on the king side. Of course, Magnus won that game, but it was a great example because it showed us how to study pawn breaks and when we should use pawn awareness to decide if the initial strategy is better or not. Now we can finally move on to the endgame. There are 2 rules you need to know when you are in an endgame. The first one is to always look for passed pawns. Basically, a pawn that has no opposing pawns to prevent it from advancing to the last rank. How do you spot a potential passed pawn? The same way you choose a college major. You just gamble. I'm joking, but the easiest way to create passed pawns is to look at pawn numbers. Take this example. On the left side, you are 2 versus 2 pawns. Obviously not ideal. In this position, whoever pushes the pawn first into attacking will probably lose. On the right side, however, we have 3 pawns and the opponent has 2. Chess and fighting have things in common because numbers do make a difference. Here we push the pawn to f5, attacking the king and the pawn. The opponent will take and then you will take back. Congratulations, you just created a passed pawn. This was easy, but in most chess games, you won't have such a clear advantage. Take this example. You do have a passed pawn, but your opponent has 3 pawns ready to rumble and you only have 2 to stop them. Considering it's white to move, what would you say is the correct course of action? Well, since we can't avoid a passed pawn from black since they have majority, we can at least choose what pawn we want to deal with. Option A, we move to f4, allowing black to create a passed pawn on g4. Option B, we instead attack with g4. The opponent then checks with the pawn in the middle, and then sacrifices their other pawn to create a passed pawn on f4. They have a protected passed pawn in both cases, but we just created another passed pawn of our own on e4. Which one of these options is better for us? Before you answer though, I need to teach you about the second rule of this video called the square rule. The square rule is simple. It helps us quickly find out if our king can catch up to an enemy pawn before promoting. First, you draw a diagonal line to the promotion rank on the side where the enemy king is. Then you build a square around those 2 points. Cool, now you have the golden square. If the king is in this square, that means the king can catch up to the pawn and stop the promotion. Great, now let's look at our options again. On option A, we build our square and the king is in it, meaning it can stop the pawn successfully if it decides to move. But here's the catch. Our passed pawn is 2 squares away from the golden square, meaning the white king cannot protect the pawn and stop the opponent's pawn from promotion. This pawn here is also protected, and if we were to attack the base of the pawn structure, then we would be outside the square once again. So, we just have no way of winning. But what if we picked option B? We build the diagonal and then we build the square. The king can protect both passed pawns and stop the promotion. That's great news, but how do we win the game? First, we make sure that the white king is always in the square, meaning, whatever we do, we cannot move our king outside of that area. Next, we use both pawns to kind of protect each other. Sure, the pawns are not directly defending each other, but they are both heading into promotion, and the king has to pay attention to them both. That is how we win the game, using pawn awareness and always keeping in mind the square rule. If we do this right, the black king will always have the ability to capture one of the pawns, but the moment he takes any of them, then the king will officially be out of the square and the other pawn will promote. This is why passed pawns are so great. Even if they don't promote, at the very least, they become a great threat, and the opponent has to divert attention to it, oftentimes sacrificing high-value pieces just to stop them. I am about to uncover one of the biggest mysteries in chess. Which is better, the bishop or the knight? They are both worth 3 points, but almost everyone seems to have a completely different opinion. That is why in this video, we will be looking into both the bishop and the knight during all stages of the game, and finally putting an end to one of the greatest questions in chess. And without spoiling, I have a few tricks for you to completely destroy one of these pieces. First, the opening. To beginners, putting the knights out feels more natural. But as the skill progresses, it becomes just a piece that needs to be developed just like the bishop. That means during the opening, these pieces are equal. However, everything changes when we move on to midgame. Here, stats matter. Knights are very good at attacking, but they are not good at applying pressure. If you wanted to pressure the king on this h-pawn here targeted by the queen, option A would be to bring the knight on g5. The opponent will simply move the pawn forward and you have to retreat. possibly just wasted a move. Option B, however, is to pressure with the bishop on c2. Here, the opponent has only two realistic moves, pawn to g6 or pawn to f5. If the opponent goes to g6, we again build pressure using our bishop, moving to the h6 square. The opponent moves the rook, and then we pin the knight and the queen by moving the bishop to g5. And then we probably keep the bishop there for a while since it really disrupts the game for black. Bishops like these just kind of remind me of campers in shooter games. While annoying, this strategy is effective in chess. Does that mean that knights are generally terrible at applying pressure? Well, they are, until the conditions meet. If you manage to put the knight out in a square that cannot be threatened by an equal or a low value piece, then that knight will completely dominate the game. It's basically the high ground meme, but for a game that has way less money involved. Like, look at this position. This knight here is safe and can pressure the opponent's side of the board without worrying that a pawn or a bishop might push it out. The knight on d5 can take the bishop and fork the king in a possible blunder, and will be a great tool when the white pieces attack the king side. In this case, the knight sounds like a camper that has activated wall hacks. On the other hand, this bishop here is completely useless. There is no way to go, and to really activate it, you need a few moves. Knights do really well in closed or crowded positions like these, but bishops are able to pressure and do well in more open positions. Here, I would rather have a knight instead of a bishop. When it comes to mid-game, these pieces' value really depends on the board. Whenever you want to exchange a knight or a bishop, you have to remember how active they are and if they can become annoying campers. But in the endgame, that's when the bishop really takes the lead because the position is more open. But hey, remember those tricks I mentioned in the beginning to get you hooked up into learning? Well, top-rated players know these tricks and constantly use them in their endgames, so you should too. First, how to avoid forks against a knight. A beginner would calculate the knight's moves and try to avoid the fork. But there is a way simpler trick to avoiding forks, and it all has to do with how the knight moves. Look at this knight in d4. If you notice, the knight is standing on a black square, and if we calculate the potential moves, these are the squares the knight can land on. But all of these squares are white, meaning the knight can only attack on one color, and it must be the opposite of the one it's standing on. A knight on a black square can only attack white squares, and a knight on a white square can only attack black squares. The knight is pretty much that friend that loves to argue with you just to piss you off even if he knows he is wrong and will probably change his mind the next day. So when you are trying to avoid forks and not calculate much, a very simple way is to have the pieces in different colored squares. Look at this position. The king and the rook are both in black squares. To avoid a fork, we move the king to a white square, and there is no way for this knight to ever reach both pieces. If you have ever wondered why two knights suck, it's exactly because of this. You might pressure with two knights, but all the opponent has to do is keep the pieces in separate colors. Two bishops, on the other hand, can just checkmate the king. But wait, there are even more tricks to really destroy the knight. This next one is called the optimal positioning. If you want to be even safer from a knight, the best spot is 2 squares away diagonally, like our king here. To deliver a check, the knight will always need to move 3 times. Here, the knight would have to go e6, f4, and h3 to finally reach the king. This is a huge issue for the knight in endgames. Imagine how funny it is that in g1, 3 squares away, the knight can fork the king and the rook. But the moment the king comes a bit closer, the knight immediately starts his 9 to 5 shift. But what if you wanted to get closer to the knight and avoid checks? Simple. You just stay on the sides of the knight instead of the diagonals. Think about it. The knight on d4 can attack any piece that stands 1 square away diagonally with just 1 move. But if we go to the sides, the knight needs at least 2 moves. Because first, he has to go to the same color square as our piece on the side, and then go to an opposite color to finally attack our piece. And this is going to blow your mind, but now we have the full picture. If you want to evade the knight and you are on the diagonals, always be even numbers away from the knight, meaning 2 and 4 squares away diagonally and you should be good. But if you are on odd numbers like 1 and 3, then the knight can reach you. When it comes to the sides of the knight, it's the opposite. The knight cannot reach you if you are on odd numbers, but it can reach you when you are even numbers away from the knight. Surely you are losing your mind right now, but there is one more thing I have to show you. How the knight and the bishop interact. Generally, these 2 pieces can evade each other pretty well, just like me and financial responsibility. But there is one case where the bishop completely demolishes the knight. Let me show you. Let's take the knight on d4 again and place the bishop 3 squares away. This bishop now covers half of all the possible knight moves. That is broken, and if the knight is on the sides, that means the bishop is completely surrounding the knight. To make it even more embarrassing, if you manage to scare the knight into a corner, then that knight becomes pretty much useless. A rook can stop it from moving, a queen can snipe it from like 6 different positions, and even the king can finally take revenge for all the forks he had to experience. Does that mean that the knight sucks in endgames? Well, yes and no. Every piece is valuable, but realistically the knight is really good in endgames when enemy pieces are close to each other and on one side of the board. Like here, it is the endgame, but the position is closed. The knight and the king can attack this pawn, and then our f-pawn will be free to promote. All because the bishop here is just too slow. If the opponent instead had a knight of his own, this game would be a draw. Another thing cool about the knight is that it really works well with the queen. Since the knight basically switches colors all game, it has an easier time coordinating attacks with the queen and can get into some sneaky positions. The queen and the bishop kind of restrict each other since they can only combine attacks in the diagonals and only on one color. However, bishops work well with rooks, and most endgames end up with a rook or 2, so that's a good bonus. But I have one last tip for you that might be a bit unethical in chess terms. If the opponent is in a time scramble when you're playing blitz or bullet, then you should probably keep the knight around, so they lose time calculating. Combine this with the strategy of throwing every blunder at your opponent to make them lose on time, and you will be winning a few games that you really shouldn't have. To finally answer the question, yes, the bishop is better than a knight. Am I telling you to always sacrifice your knights? No, I just want you to understand the advantages and disadvantages that come with these pieces. In my case, I really hate bishops because they really remind me of camping, so I will always choose a knight instead. You probably know what this piece is. The queen, considered one of the most powerful pieces in chess. But what if I told you that this queen is holding you back and could be the reason why you are losing some of your games? Don't worry, I'm here to help. In this video, we will be analyzing the queen in all stages of the game, and finally answering the question of, are you using the queen correctly? Before we start with the opening, first you need to understand piece activity. Don't worry, I'm making a line graph to show you. On the bottom we have the stages of the game: opening, mid-game, and endgame. On the left we have piece activity, meaning how active a piece is in a specific stage of the game. To show how this graph works, let's take a pawn and analyze it. During the opening, the pawn is very active, starting from maximum activity, since a game can't really develop if the pawns don't go fighting each other. But pawn activity lowers during the mid-game, and goes even lower in the endgame. After all, even if you use pawns in the endgame, they will mostly be used to promote. But what about the knight and the bishop? Typically, the knight is more active than the bishop during the opening and middle game. But in the endgame, bishops cover a lot more space, thus increasing their activity. Now these next graphs might make you a bit sad. This is the rook graph, and they are pretty much lonely for almost all the opening. If we include castling, then things get a bit better. In the ending, however, they do pop off. They are the Magnus Carlsen of chess pieces. But what about the queen? This is the activity graph. First, let's start with the opening. One of the biggest mistakes I see beginners make is that they really like to send the queen out in the open since it is so powerful. They do this for 2 reasons. One, they are hoping to get a piece for free if the opponent blunders. And to be fair, that happens sometimes in beginner games, but that doesn't mean you should just hope to be lucky. The second reason is the idea that if the enemy attacks my queen, I can just move it away since it has so many squares available. That's what everyone thinks before they trap their queen, and then they are forced to give it away. So, as we see here, the queen should have minimal activity. If your graph looks like this, then the queen is holding your other piece's development back. You will be more focused on protecting your queen rather than peacefully developing and countering your opponent. If you are making this mistake, stop doing it. Pick an opening you like and go with that. No more of that scholar's mate opening except when you're playing bullet because that's actually funny. Next, the middle game. You look at this graph and you're probably confused. Why is the middle game activity higher than the endgame activity? Does that mean that the queen is terrible at endgames? No, stop overthinking it and let me explain. The middle game is complicated and the queen is an important part in winning your battles. But here is another mistake beginners like to make in middle games. They focus on attacking with the queen instead of attacking alongside the queen. If you find the sentence confusing, let me break it down for you in a way you can understand. Attacking with the queen, you have something like this. The queen is in front of the bishop and it's leading the attack on the enemy king. It looks menacing, but it's terrible. The opponent can block easily depending on the position. And it all has to do with the fact that the queen is worth 9 points. The opponent knows that you won't sacrifice it. So any defense they do is devastating since you can't exchange your queen for a lower value piece. But even if that wasn't a huge red flag, another reason is also coverage. Chess is a coverage game, meaning you want to cover more squares than your opponent. By having the queen in front of the bishop, you do the opposite of that. These squares are already covered by the bishop. The queen is probably better in a place where she can have more influence and cover areas where the other pieces might have an issue. Now let's go over the correct way of playing the middle game, attacking alongside the queen, and this puzzle will help you understand what I mean. As you can see, the queen here cannot do anything on her own. This pawn is protected by the king, and this other pawn is protected by the queen and the bishop. If we check the king, he can just step away and then he quickly trades bishops. However, the queen being here still means a lot when you use other pieces alongside it. So, what do we do? Well, we look at the other pieces and how they can help. The bishop here is kind of stuck. Both e6 and a6 are bad exchanges. However, in complicated positions like this, the knight is fearsome. The correct move is to go knight to c6. Hold on, Mayhem. Doesn't the opponent just get a free knight? Well, no, because if he takes with the pawn, we can take the a6 pawn with the bishop, then it's an instant mate. Black, of course, doesn't do that and goes queen to d6. We then just exchange bishops and then take the rook. Congratulations! You used the queen correctly by working with the pieces instead of leading the attack. And now you are 2 points up of material and the king is exposed. Another funny thing about this puzzle is how useless the black queen is. The queen is defending with the other pieces, instead of defending alongside them. We even have this precious bishop-queen combination which does absolutely nothing. Good job, you learned how to use the queen in middle games. But now it's the endgame, and for that we have to look at the graph again. Why does the queen activity fall off during the endgame? This has a simple answer, because more often than not, they get traded. Some chess players even believe that it isn't called an endgame until queens are off the board. And that's definitely not true, but it's kind of uncommon to have queens as the last 2 pieces on the board. So how should you use your queen in endgames? The answer depends on these 3 things: king protection, queen advantage, and piece connection. Look at this position, and let's understand these 3 concepts. First, king protection. If the enemy king is in the open, that means you have an advantage. Look at this white king. Nothing protects it. If it is checked, it would be forced to move. This white queen covers some area, but the bishop and the rook do not do much. Let's compare it to our black king. This pawn defends the diagonal, and this rook and bishop protect horizontally. This is huge for a simple reason. The white queen has to pay attention to its king, but the black queen is free to roam and lead the attack. Now for the second concept, queen advantage. By looking at the king's protection, you realize that technically you have the same points of materials, but the black queen is worth more based on the position. This is called queen advantage. If you are white, you will want to exchange queens because it really makes life so much easier for the white king. If you are black in this position, you must focus on the king and queen relationship. Never, and I mean never, allow white to check your king and also attack the queen at the same time. That will force an exchange, and you will immediately blow your advantage. Third and final, piece connection. This concept is simple. How well do pieces work with each other? If we look at black, the rook is limiting the king from going on the king side. The queen and the bishop are together, and in middle game that was bad, but in endgame it's the opposite, since there are less pieces and the king is not so easily defendable. In endgames, the queen is free to lead the attack, and the diagonal covered by these 2 pieces is great, even if you don't play the best moves. White, on the other hand, really has it rough. This bishop is targeting nothing. This rook is undefended and has limited movement since it's in front of the king. The queen is just in a bad spot and cannot counter the enemy queen. If we play this game out, you really see how terrible the white queen is. Since the king has no safe squares, the white queen has to sacrifice herself, and black wins the game shortly after. Good job, you learned how to effectively use the queen. That's it. Go increase your chess knowledge now. I have analyzed countless chess games of Magnus Carlsen starting from his openings, mid-game, and all the way up to his endgame tactics. In this video, we will break down everything and, in the process, make you a better chess player and hopefully narrow the distance between you and Magnus. But enough talking, let's get immediately into openings. First, Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. Looking into only tournament games, the most popular opening Magnus has played as white is the Ruy Lopez Berlin defense with 56 total games. From those, he has only lost 9 games, won 33, and drew 14. But why is this opening so good? Well, let's look at it. White opens up with e4 and black follows with e5. You put the knight out attacking the pawn and black defends. Then you move the bishop to f5 attacking the knight. Black responds with knight to f6 attacking your pawn on e4. After this, most players would castle on the king side, and 50% of all those games would end in a draw. But that's not what Magnus does. Magnus always likes to place the pawn on d3 to protect the pawn here, and then Magnus chooses the move order based on his preparation. If the opponent goes to c5 with his bishop, white follows with the castling. Black opens up the path for the bishop while defending his pawn, and then Magnus stops it from getting close to the knight with the pawn h3 move. Then Magnus takes the knight after the bishop is threatened. But sometimes he also switches the order by taking the knight immediately and then developing his other pieces. Like, a funny example is this game in 2022. After the exchange, Magnus just decides to attack the king side while keeping the king seemingly wide exposed. Ruy Lopez offers a few options in how you want to proceed with the game, but keep in mind something important. Most games with this opening will end up with both black and white castling kingside. The white pieces will focus their attack on kingside. Meanwhile, the black pieces will instead protect and focus on attack through the queenside. Overall though, the kingside is where the battlefield is going to happen. A funny game between Magnus and against Anish Giri ended up with both players castling queenside, and the endgame speaks for itself. Now let's go over the second most popular opening. The Queen's Gambit Declined. Though you might be confused on the difference between Queen's Gambit Accepted and the declined version. Trust me, it sounds complicated, but it really isn't. The game begins and white plays d4. Opponent follows with d5. Then white pushes pawn to c4. This is the Queen's Gambit starting position, and the opponent will do one of these two things. Defend the pawn with e6, or just take the pawn. By taking, you accept the gambit. By defending, you decline. Most grandmasters, including Magnus, will choose the declined variation because at this level, it just seems safer to do with the black pieces. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with accepting the gambit, but the only thing to remember is if you accept, then this pawn here is as good as gone, and you should focus on developing your other pieces. In this game between Maxim and Magnus, Maxim won even though he accepted the gambit. With 23 wins and 7 losses, how does Magnus play the declined version when he is playing the white pieces? Well, pretty standard actually. The board almost always ends up like this. The bishop is on f4, both knights are out covering the center, and there is a solid pawn chain here. Black, on the other hand, is more defensive. His knight is protecting this pawn and covering the center. The bishop stops any potential knight pin while still being developed on this important diagonal, and the king is tucked away in safety. One thing I must warn you about though, is that this opening becomes really complex during the mid-game because of how many possible moves both you and your opponent really have. In some games, Magnus likes to take this pawn here. In this 2020 game against Hikaru, Magnus pushed this c4 pawn forward. Alireza in 2022 after developing took the pawn, and then managed to snatch the win away from Magnus. Queen's Gambit being so complex is probably why he played this opening in 53 games with white. But funny enough, this opening is also second place with 50 games in which Magnus has the black pieces, with 11 wins, 7 losses, and 32 draws. Now it's time to find out what Magnus's most popular opening as black is, and probably his favorite opening in general. Based on the numbers, Magnus has played the Sicilian defense 115 times. Here's how the Sicilian defense usually goes. White plays e4, black follows with pawn to c5, white puts the knight out in f3, and black follows with a knight of his own c6. This is how 115 games have gone so far, but then the opening can change a bit. If white plays bishop to b5, then that is how 59 of those games have gone, with 16 wins, 12 losses, and 21 draws. Here, Magnus typically will push the pawn to e6 or e5. The other 56 games have gone differently, with 16 wins, 8 losses, and 32 draws. It's still the Sicilian opening, but this time white will play pawn to d4. Black will take, and then white will take with the knight. Then both players put out their knights. After this, Magnus always follows with pawn to e5 to push the knight out and take back some control of the center. All these openings are great, and Magnus is known as the guy who tries different openings just for the fun of it, but he is probably going to be remembered for the Sicilian defense. With so many successful games, it's kind of obvious why everyone and their grandma started playing the Sicilian. Now we are moving on to midgame, and things aren't so simple as looking at numbers anymore. However, you are still in luck because I have identified a simple tactic that Magnus constantly uses in his midgame all the way up to endgames. It's called pace control, and I have the perfect game to show you how Magnus uses it. Here the opponent has the white pieces, and it looks terrible for Magnus. After all, this knight here is targeting the queen, and most of the black pieces are not doing much, except for this bishop that is targeting the white rook. Not to mention most pieces are close together, meaning a fork from the knight is very possible. So, what does Magnus do? If you thought queen to d8, good job, you defended your queen, but you are playing the game of your opponent. Magnus instead planned something else. He moved queen to e8. This seems kind of scary. After all, knight to c7 is just waiting to fork both the queen and the rook. However, Magnus knows that by moving the queen here, he is creating a bigger attack than the opponent. If the opponent moves the knight, Magnus takes, and after a few exchanges, he ends up with the piece up. Of course, the opponent doesn't do that, and instead retreats his rook. But this is only move 1 into controlling the pace. Magnus's next move is something that a normal human would probably never do. He goes bishop to d8. This looks terrible and goes against many chess principles, but Magnus does not see it that way. Here's why Magnus made that weird move. First, he wanted to block the knight. If you watched my knights video, you know that a bishop 3 squares away completely counters the knight. Secondly, Magnus had plans to pressure the white bishop, and in the process, he wanted to get rid of this weak pawn. But third and most importantly, Magnus wanted to disorganize the opponent and make him feel like he's losing control of the game. This pace control tactic is used in almost every sport, but no one does it as well in chess as Magnus Carlsen. His memory and calculation offer him a great advantage, but you too can use this tactic. Find out what the opponent wants to do and think of other possibilities of what to do. Trust me, it's going to end well for you. Now it's time for the endgame, and here's where most grandmasters really fear Magnus. There are 2 reasons why Magnus Carlsen is known as the endgame god. The first one is obvious. This man is really good at endgames when it comes to calculating. But the second reason is because Magnus literally changed the game with how he approaches endgames. Here's a quick history lesson. Before Magnus Carlsen, grandmasters would draw games a lot, and that made chess a bit boring. They had the idea that if an endgame reaches a point of theoretical draw, then it wasn't worth playing it out and getting tired over nothing. Then Magnus Carlsen comes in and completely changes the game. Magnus believed that almost every endgame can be won, and a simple mistake can determine the game. After all, humans aren't chess robots, and they can make mistakes due to fatigue or pressure. The best example is this game of Magnus vs Nepo in 2021. The game lasted 8 hours, and the endgame was brutal. Both players shuffled their pieces for 50 moves, and for this whole time, it was a theoretical draw. But Magnus knew that Nepo would succumb to the pressure sooner or later, and that is why he won in the end. I know that I said Magnus was going to be known for his Sicilian defense, but his resilience in the endgames literally influenced the new generation to play like he does. So as overdone as this trope may be, if you want to play like Magnus Carlsen, you must never give up no matter how bad a position might look. But also, you still have to learn a lot. and I suggest you start with this video that will completely change how you use pawns in your chess games, and will probably make you win a lot more endgames. Or more precisely, win endgames in the Magnus Carlsen style of dominating the game using pawns. Did you know that in 2017, Liren played over 100 classical games without a single loss and had a peak rating of 2816? However, that brings up the question, how does Liren play chess? In this video, we will be looking into Liren's most used openings, variations, and his style of play, and in the process help you play like Ding in your own games. But enough talking, let's get immediately into openings. First, Liren with the white pieces. Looking into only tournament games, the most popular opening Ding has played as white is King's Indian Defense, with 55 total games. And in the second place, we have the Queen's Gambit Declined, with 50 games total. These are different openings, but why are these two openings so close in games? Well, it's because of Ding forcing the opponent to make a choice. Here, let's take the King's Indian Defense first. White opens with d4, black goes knight f6, then white goes to c4. This is the start of the opening for Ding. But do you see something weird? Yup, it's this pawn structure here. In all 105 games involved, the first two moves of Ding are always d4 and c4. This is basically Queen's Gambit. And I think Ding is trying to tell the opponent that, hey, we are either playing Queen's Gambit Declined or the King's Indian Defense. Let's go back to the board. If the opponent goes to g6, then they enter the King's Indian Defense. If the opponent had instead gone d5 or e6, then it would be Queen's Gambit Declined. But what's next for the King's Indian? Simple. White plays knight to c3. Opponent goes bishop g7. White covers more of the center with e4, and black plays d6 to avoid this pawn here going forward and attacking the knight. White then plays knight to f3, and black castles. White wants to castle too, so they put the bishop on e2. Black then finally turns this into a two-player game, with the move e5. White doesn't take and instead castles. Black then develops the other knight. This is the main line of the King's Indian Defense. But surprisingly, Ding has not encountered the main line often in his games, because most of the time, he himself goes into a different variation to try to immediately throw the opponent off, and hope to win the game with white. Look at this game. After Ding confirms that the opponent is playing the King's Indian, he then goes g3, to later prepare for bishop g2. Then he forms the pawn chain on the queen side of the board. This other game here starts normal. But then again, Ding goes out of the main line by going pawn to f3. White forms a pawn chain that takes control of the center, but it has a bit of a drawback. This knight here has some trouble developing to the usual f3 square, and this diagonal here is kinda troublesome if white wants to castle. Now it's time for your favorite part, the stats for this opening. Using the King's Indian Defense, Liren has won 19 games, lost 8, and drew 28. When it comes to the second opening on the list, the Queen's Gambit Declined. Out of 50 games, Ding has won 21, lost 6 times, and drew 23 games. This opening is really popular, and even Magnus has played it 53 times. If you're curious how the opening works, you can watch the video How to Play Like Magnus after finishing this video. However, I still want to show you the third most played opening for Liren. It's called the English opening, but specifically the Botvinnik system. Here's something funny. Game starts and white goes c4. Congratulations, you just entered the English opening. However, the Botvinnik is more complicated. This is the end position for white, and it doesn't really matter the order of the moves, so let's go from left to right. First, these two knights here. First one on c3 and the other one on e2. They're there to assist the pawns and to stop the black pieces from taking advantage of the d4 square. The pawns form a triangle and control the d5 square, and a strong move for white is to put the knight on d5. The center and the queen side is where the battlefield will happen, but the white king is tucked away in safety, and the bishop offers a support role on this white diagonal. For Ding, it's gone quite well, with 30 total games, 10 wins, 6 losses, and 14 draws. Now it's time for the openings where Ding has the black pieces. The first place is Roy Lopez, the closed variation. It sounds complicated, but it's very easy to understand when the variation is closed or not. This is the starting position for the Ruy Lopez. I'm sure you have encountered this in your games. In an open variation, black will push the bishop out, place the knight on f6, white castles, and black takes the pawn. Don't be too happy though, it isn't a free pawn, but this is considered the Ruy Lopez open variation. But what about the closed one? Well, it doesn't change much. Instead of taking the pawn, black instead goes bishop to e7, closing the position. Most pro chess players, including Ding, will choose the closed version because this is the opening that offers the most drawing chances with black at the highest level. Time for the stats. Ding Liren has played 60 total games with this opening, 11 wins, 13 losses, and 36 draws. Now for the second place opening. White goes e4 and you follow with e5. White develops the knight with f3 and you go knight c6. Then finally bishop c4. This is called the Italian game, and it's probably one of the oldest and most studied openings in chess. Ding, though, is very good at it. With 35 games total, he drew 17 games, won 11, and lost 7. And to make it even crazier, 4 of these losses were recent when he wasn't in the best shape. Here's a fun fact. The third place opening for Ding is the French defense. With 27 games, this seems like something Ding uses often, but to my surprise, the last time he has touched this opening was in 2012. So if it shows up in the World Championship, that would be really funny. Since we covered the openings, it's time for style of play. If I could summarize Ding's playstyle in 2 words, it would be calculation and resilience. With that, I have the perfect game to show you why. This is the position of Game 6 between Ding and Nepo. A bit of context. Ding was not handling the World Championship very well, and was having trouble dealing with the stress of it. But this is the game that showed to everyone Ding's resilience, and that he was not going to let anyone get in his way. And it all started with the move pawn to d5. This was basically Ding saying that he would win this game. Why was he so sure? Well, let's analyze it. Nepo pushes this pawn on a2, and as we can see, this passed pawn is close to promotion. This bishop is not only protecting the pawn, but it's also covering the important g6 square that the knight really needs. However, the queen is chilling. White, on the other hand, is on a time clock. It needs to end the game soon or things will get out of hand. First, he moved queen to c7. This formed an attack on the g7 square, with the idea of the knight going to g6, to free the way and to also check the king. Nepo of course doesn't let the check happen by going king g6, but the knight still opens the path to the g7 square. Nepo protects the pawn and avoids mate in 1, but then Ding goes queen f7, and Nepo immediately resigns. After this move, he finally saw Ding's full plan. Black would go queen g5, and then Ding would have sacrificed the queen. Black has to take and then rook a8 to check the king again. There are only 2 squares possible for black. For h7, the king would get checkmate with rook h8. For h7, the king gets checkmated with rook to f8. But why is this checkmate so impressive? Because every other square is covered by the rook and the knight, except for this square that is covered by the pawn, that Ding Liren moved in the beginning of this whole strategy. This video will upload before the World Championship, and I really hope Ding will surprise everyone and show that he is still as scary as before. If you want to play like Ding Liren, play some of his favorite openings, but most importantly, keep that resilience up and never let your failures dictate your future. That is in chess, but also in life.